It's a great pleasure to welcome to the MyBroadband conference Vino Govender, who is the Chief Strategy and Mergers, Acquisitions and Innovations. That's a long title, Vino, at DFA, Dark Fiber Africa. Vino, great pleasure to welcome you. How are you doing firstly?
I'm great, Aki, and doing well.
That's good, man. Listen, I'm sure that this COVID-19 pandemic has changed all of our lives, as we know, and I shudder to think if it wasn't for Dark Fiber Africa and the thousands of kilometers of fiber that you guys have added, that how life would have been without this fiber. But I'm sure it's interesting times for your organization and the expansion. And I'm sure the demand and the drive to supply has been insane for Dark Fiber Africa. Tell us about it and the demand for connectivity services.
Yeah, okay, and to your point, I mean, I think the change was coming. COVID just accelerated the rate at which we moved and adopted the change. And on the back of that, we've seen a lot of the change was driven by the adoption of digital technologies. And that's right across the spectrum, on the consumer side for content and entertainment, on the education side, from a government perspective and industry perspective as well, delivery of government services, the delivery of health services. So yeah, it's been and even on the business side. I mean, just look at us now. Working remotely, collaborating on platforms such as Teams, Blue Jeans. It's become it's the norm now,
Yes.
and all that consumes data traffic, both on an access networks, on the edge networks. All these things touch data centers somewhere, where these platforms are hosted. So, yeah, definitely has had a profound impact
Yeah.
on consumption.
I mean, Vino, have you guys seen any interesting data traffic trends change in the last 12 months versus to the previous 12 months? I would imagine that video, for example, must have shot up.
Yeah, so because we on the layer two side of it, we don't see what the traffic type is. But I mean, we work closely with industry, and yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at the mobile network operators, the exponential increase in traffic, largely driven by entertainment content,
Yes.
educational services.
I mean,
I mean,
would you say that traffic has more than doubled on running through DFA?
yeah, on our active network, we've seen significant increased demand on, let's say, active network. I'm talking about where we do layer two
Yeah.
services.
Yeah.
And when I look at the mobile network operators increasing traffic, it's definitely would have been more than doubled on the core network, which you buy from us on a dark
Yes.
fiber perspective, but they move their traffic through.
100%, 100%. No, it's just interesting to note from a perspective of a second tier provider. But you look at this growth that you touched on just now and the demand that we're seeing, and there's an incredible demand there. Is this demand going to translate in increase in the economy? Is it going to be good for the economy? I imagine so.
Yeah, so it has direct and indirect impact on economic, not just on economic, on socio-economic aspects, right? So when we look at where from a demand side perspective, so let's talk about the demand side, right? And what's critical to ensure that we that the demand is created is you're going to have the relevant content, and when we talk, and content has its own value chain, right? So,
Mm.
especially when it comes to video traffic, it's we look at local content is what drives it globally. If you just look at Nigeria as an example, the amount of local content created in Nigeria for Nigerians, and that traffic moves to the mobile networks, other networks as well, but predominantly to the mobile networks, and it creates an incentive. It justifies the incentive for the rollout of access services into the market because the demand translates. Now, when you look at and I'm just using just one part of content. When you look at that content value stream, right? It starts with content production. So so more people producing content. It deals with content aggregation. the guys that aggregate the content and delivery across networks, mobile networks, fixed networks, the content curation. Just that sliver is an economic, call it an economy on its own. Now, if you take that content and you apply it to entertainment content, apply it to education content, apply it to health type of content, and business content, it has, you see the impact that it has, because it creates value, increased value along the value chain. And that's just content, right? We're not even talking about cloud services. We're not even talking about the development of new innovative services as well on top of that. So definitely has an impact on the economy, but also it has an impact on, and I said, socio-economic, so economy, and also on social aspect, people getting access to better services, if we put it that way, better access to services, access to richer services, and access to more relevant services.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, COVID has taught us so many lessons, right? I mean, in your business specifically, you look at the demand for connectivity services, as you've mentioned, and the lessons that we've learned. I mean, what kind of lessons can we learn from this experience of COVID-19 and the demand that it's brought upon us?
Well, okay, and we've always known this, but from our perspective, it's demand will grow. And it will continually grow, and you got to be ready to do that, to deliver the demand, on the demand, right? And what's important is that on the supply side, that you have the infrastructure, that's scalable, that's available, scalable, and resilient to meet the demand. You cannot, you can have a model, or you've got to have models where you can turn up supply to meet the demand. And I'll give you a simple example, right? When the mobile network, when the demand for traffic on the mobile networks increased exponentially, on our side, where we provide the dark fiber to the mobile network operators for backhaul, I mean, the ability to scale up the capacity on the dark fiber wasn't difficult to do, because the fibers were there, the infrastructure was there, and it just meant the mobile network operators lighting up more capacity on the infrastructure. So they were able to meet it on the backhaul side, and that's where we said, as I talk to this example, and at the same time, there are two options: do I densify the network, do I roll out more sites to meet the demand? And that really, would have taken would be a longer thing to do during COVID time, and then government released temporary spectrum. So
That's right.
that the release of that spectrum created, along with the infrastructure on the supply side, and spectrum allocation is a supply side intervention, created the headroom, or the capacity to create the headroom to meet the growing demand on mobile traffic. So I think the key lesson to be taken out is not to underestimate the importance in investing in infrastructure, not for the short term, but for the long term.
Yeah, that's an excellent point you make there. And you obviously look at also those key decision makers in South Africa. How can they be, assisting in really driving that digital literacy in South Africa? Because I think that's key as well, isn't it?
Yeah, digital literacy is, you're right, Aki. It's important from a demand side perspective, right? It's also important from the supply side, and I'll touch on the two aspects very briefly. On the demand side, people are only going to use or consume services, if they know how to do it, if they know how to navigate the device, if they are familiar with the user interfaces. So and they also need to know that it's available out there. So digital literacy, the ability to understand what digital services, the awareness around it, what digital services, applications, content is there. How do I find it? How do I access it? And how do I consume it? Is important, because that drives demand. Once again, if there's a deficit on the supply side, if demand increases, basic economics, if demand exceeds supply, it creates an incentive for the supply side to meet that demand because there's a deficit, right? And that's important. So we talked about digital literacy and the importance that it plays from a demand side perspective. More digitally literate citizens or users drive up demand, create an incentive for supply side investment. And then on the supply side, digital literacy is also important. And the reason being is that, networks continually to evolve. Technologies continually evolve. And when I talk about digital literacy here, I'm more referring to the skills, the developer skills, the engineering skills, the digital skills that create those services on platforms that also in turn drive demand side consumption. So I can't stress the importance of digital literacy, and it's the responsibility of society as a whole. It doesn't rest purely on the shoulders of government. It rests on, they drive policy around that. It also rests on the shoulders of corporates, ensuring that they are training up, investing in training the workforce, and the education sector, the tertiary education sector, that we have the right curriculum in place so that we compete. Yeah.
Vino, I guess that when you look at the scale of what you've been talking about and this incredible growth and demand, I think that, there's no one organization that can do this alone. And I think that it's so important for there to be collaboration between organizations. And I just want you to highlight the importance of collaboration between the key role players to meet the supply, demand, and the service delivery and driving this demand. I think collaboration is key in this environment that you're talking about.
It is, and to a large extent, collaboration is embedded in that ecosystem, right? So if I could just highlight what the ecosystem consists of. Okay, you've got content and services or content production, like I talked about. You've got the device manufacturers, because you access stuff through the devices. You've got policy, and policy is important because policy looks at, hey, how do we firstly like harmonize spectrum so that we create an environment where network equipment, devices can be produced at scale, and produced at scale and volume. And get to accessible price for investments. So policy is important as well. Networks are important as well, right? And here we're talking about mobile networks, fixed networks and wireless networks, and fixed transcends from from fiber-based networks to other technologies. But I see a lot of migration onto fiber now because just of the resiliency of it, and the wireless technologies, right? And why and how collaboration happens is through standards, right? So we have a standard from the ITU around spectrum as an example. So that drives collaboration, harmonization around that point, and it brings the device and the network ecosystems together. So that's important, and we collaborate. The collaboration that also needs to happen, which what you're referring to as well, is how domestically, how do we collaborate to ensure that we don't that we meet demand in the most efficient manner. And that's why, from our perspective, JP's model has always been to aggregate common demand on common infrastructure. And that's the principle of wholesale open access. And that can only be achieved through collaboration. So we, as a business, we look at the market demand forecast out there, we work with the analysts, we look at what the forecasts are looking at, where areas are, and we work with the operators as well. Where is rollout happening? Independently, we work with them, and then we take that market data, we take the operator data, we look at trading data, and we then prioritize and invest in network rollout to ensure that the infrastructure becomes available. So we collaborate in that way. I think the other more important area of collaboration, Aki, and that you guys have also been a critical part of that is collaborating with other stakeholders. So collaborating with the likes of government policymakers, NGOs, and that's where the platforms like MyBroadband, like the Digital Council of South Africa, like the South African Communications Forum as an example. These are just platforms that, and working closely with the department, we collaborate to ensure that, hey, while we're meeting the needs of the private sector from a network perspective, we also meet the connectivity objectives of government as well, where we can. And so I'll just leave it there. And it's something that we engage on regularly, from a collaboration perspective.
Well, you touched on earlier on open access connectivity, and of course DFA is a pioneer in this regard. I mean, you guys have really driven that open access connectivity in South Africa, there's no doubt about it. What is DFA's role in improving the supply and demand of connectivity in South Africa? I mean, you touched on some of the aspects, but you guys have got a massive role in doing this, and the next 5 years I think are going to be critical.
It is, and let's just talk, on our role on the supply side, and I'll recap on that. It's our ability to aggregate common demand on common infrastructure means that we make the investment and the ability to roll out to gain access to infrastructure at a much more efficient level. Just because we bring common demand on common infrastructure gives us scale, right? And having said that, that model has enabled us to roll out, I think it's close to 13,000, 14,000 kilometers of fiber nationally. And we continue to densify, our network in the areas that we're present in. So from a supply side, what we've done, the open access model has enabled, and the efficiency that comes with capital investment has enabled us, to meet supply or deliver supply to these areas. And that's directly what we do, right? Let's talk about the demand side quickly, right? And I'll talk about specifically, let's talk about the mobile network operators, right? As we put that supply in, it means that they can reach more consumers, deliver a better customer experience, and better customer experience, driven through higher capacity access speeds. And what that does is then, you get more users using services because of the user experience. So that drives demand. That's the one way. The other area that we drive demand is, if you think about it, okay, and you've been around for a while, right? Back in the day, access to certain applications and services were kind of limited to the corporate enterprise space, where they ran their own IT departments and they had an on-premise deployment of infrastructure or had their own private cloud environment. Through the connectivity that we've delivered, we've also enabled the hyperscalers, the cloud computing players, and even some of the services that were traditionally license-based on-prem and now moved to the cloud. We've enabled these guys to place their points of distribution in the country because the access mediums are now there for businesses to consume the services. So that's driven the demand, not just that was predominantly at the enterprise space, into the SME, small, medium, and small, micro, and medium enterprise as well, which shows you that it's increased that demand on their side as well, and that's how we've driven demand in the business sector as well, for services. And I guess I'll leave that there.
No, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating listening to you, and just looking at the landscape of where we are, and you look at the growth that's expected over the next few years, and the investments that have been made into data centers. I mean, it's extraordinary. Surpassing the investment in many other continents in terms of what they are putting, laying down in the ground with data centers and cloud providers coming onto the continent. And in South Africa, we've had a few ready, and this is expected to increase. My question to you is, do we have the capacity in the ground with fiber and undersea cables to meet this demand that's expected in the next 5 years? Do we have that kind of capacity, or does more investment need to be made in that regard?
I'll start with the undersea cables, right? And the undersea cables, I mean, there's a few that's landing now. The most notable ones are the ones that's coming down from Mauritius, the Two Africa One system from Facebook, and I think when you look at undersea capacity, those investments have significantly enough headroom to cater for traffic coming into the country. And remember, they're moving content across, right? The data center environment, what the data center does is it creates the ability to cache that content locally. So at the same time, with more capacity coming in and data center capacity being available to cache that type of content, it's kind of sorts out the international bandwidth, right? To your point, how then do we now move the traffic from the data centers to the end consumers? And is there enough fiber in the ground? And if we just look at existing fiber is there, right? I think collectively it addresses market demand, but does it address entire market demand? No, not really. Okay, I mean, I've looked at some of the forecasts from the likes of BMI-T and Africa Analysis, and there's still significant growth on the fiber to the business side, FTTB side. And then if you just reflect now on the sunsetting of some copper technologies and ADSL, for example, that means that, these technologies are being sunsetted, but they need to be replaced by something else, right? Which means there's still room to move fiber access into that space as well. So when we talk about undersea capacity, comfortable around that, coming into data center is required to cache that content. And not just that, you find also enterprises are no longer saying, hey, we'll keep our private cloud on-prem. We rather move our private cloud environment to a hosted environment, much more easier to manage, much more resilient. I mean, so many issues around power and stuff like that, security. So, they do that. And then let's deliver it to the consumers, to the businesses and the end user consumers. And that's why you kind of see, there's still a lot more room for the growth of business access, last mile access fiber. And then when you're growing last mile access fiber, then you need the backhaul fiber to the aggregation nodes. So still a lot more work to be done in that space. But it's why we exist.
Listen, it's exciting, and you've really painted a picture there and made it palatable for us to understand how it all works. Vino Govender, thank you so much for joining us. Vino is the Chief Strategy, Mergers, Acquisitions and Innovations at DFA. Vino, we look forward to chatting to you again at the next conference and looking at the progress that's been made. We thank you for your time and we wish you well. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Aki, and thank you for the role that you guys play in industry as well in terms of building awareness and driving collaboration as well.